Hi there, and welcome from all of us at Common Sense to our very first webinar of this year. Move over, Playboy. Online pornography is here, and our kids are watching. I'm Lisa Solomon, and I connect Common Sense with schools across the country. We're so grateful for the support and the partnership of the many school communities joining us, and thankful to all of you who support the nonprofit work that we do. So we will be discussing pornography in the coming hour. So note that this discussion is really intended for parents and caregivers, not kids. But we will send you a link to the recording. And if you feel it's appropriate, I encourage you to co-view it together with your kids at another time so you can discuss it together. And we do have medical professionals joining us later, but here's my disclaimer that this content is for educational purposes only and doesn't substitute for professional medical advice or consultation with healthcare professionals. Our goal in this session is to support you as you help your children manage the technology in their lives. Today's topic can be sensitive, but we are here to help and support you. It's always my goal that you will come away with at least 2 or 3 tips you can try right away. But a small bit of advice after this session, please don't go and brain dump everything all over your kids. I always recommend you parse it out in small, teachable moments, or we all get tuned out. I've learned that the hard way with my children. I have a few housekeeping items. This session will run for between 50 minutes to an hour. We'll do our very best to answer questions along the way. But please rest assured that our team has read all the questions submitted ahead of time, and many have been threaded into our prep for this discussion. If you are joining us live, I encourage you to pop comments and new questions into the chat, as we'll be monitoring those in real time. Our team will also add useful resources in the chat, so keep an eye on that as well. I now get the pleasure to hand you over to our moderator for today's discussion, Dr. Dolly Klock. Dolly serves on the Common Sense Los Angeles Advisory Council and is a board-certified family physician and the founder of ADOLESSONS. And she's also a speaker, a consultant, and a parent of 2 teens. With more than 20 years of experience helping families connect over tricky topics, Dr. Klock offers private consultation and group workshops for parents, teens, and tweens on everything from puberty and sexuality to adolescent health and behavior. Dolly's going to start with an overview of a new Common Sense research report entitled Teens and Pornography, which will help lay the foundation for this conversation. So glad to see you, Dolly. I'm going to hand this over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa, for that intro. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you this evening discussing this really important research from Common Sense. We now have data to back up what we know anecdotally to be true, and that is that kids are often exposed to sexual images from a very young age. The top takeaway of this new research is this: 3/4 of teens say they have watched pornography online, and the average age of first viewing porn is 12. We also learned from this research that while some teens are viewing porn intentionally, many are also having unintentional exposure, which is why we're here to think through the why and the how to talk with our kids about this very tricky topic, even if we would like to think that they would never seek out porn on their own. And I recognize that this subject matter is complex. Every family is different. So truly, we hope that you will take some time to think about how tonight's information fits in within the structure and values of your particular family. So before we dig into the details of the research, I want to address the fact that we had many, and I mean many, questions submitted by parents about how to control the devices kids are on and prevent them from stumbling upon unwanted images in the first place. And with very young children, we may be able to do this effectively to a point. So we will drop into the chat the Common Sense article about how to block porn. Please keep in mind that as kids age, banning devices and blocking sites becomes less effective, which is why the best parenting tactic may be leaning into some open and honest conversations with our kids about sex and, yes, even about porn. So we have a few amazing experts here today to help guide this discussion. First off, we're going to hear about the research from the woman that conducted it. Dr. Supreet Mann is the Senior Research Manager at Common Sense Media. She holds a PhD in communication and an MS in child development from UC Davis. Her research considers the role of social influences on children's socio-emotional outcomes, including pro-social behavior, risk-taking, and learning. Supreet, thank you for this really important work that you are doing. We're so looking forward to hearing from you. Can you give us a summary of your most significant findings?
Hi, Dolly. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to share some of the findings from our recently released Teens and Pornography report. To kind of give some background, I think the internet has made pornography much more accessible to children and adults alike, and the media often portrays pornography as a major public health concern that can have lasting impacts on children and teens. So we really wanted to see what the online pornography landscape actually looks like in terms of exposure, how adolescents feel about pornography generally, and whether they're talking to others about what they're experiencing both online and in person. So we partnered with Benenson Strategy Group and conducted a demographically representative survey of over 1,300 teens aged 13 to 17. And we examined overall exposure to online pornography, including frequency of exposure and the type of content that they're viewing. And our findings were really interesting. So we found that in general, a majority of teens in our survey have been exposed to pornography. 73% said that they've been exposed to pornography, whether intentionally or accidentally. Of those who have viewed pornography, more than half reported that they had seen it by the time they were 13, with, like you said, average age of exposure at 12. And 15% reported that they first saw pornography at age 10 or younger. And we often think of pornography as a gendered problem. We have this sort of perception that boys view it a lot more than girls do. But the survey specifically found that cisgender boys and girls had almost the same rate of pornography consumption. So not as much of a gendered problem as we typically think it is. In the survey, we also oversampled LGBTQ plus teens, so we could compare these teens to their cisgender peers for any differences in use or frequency of exposure. And one really interesting notable finding from this is that the LGBTQ plus teens do use pornography at higher rates intentionally than their cisgender peers. And finally, I think the biggest takeaway from the research is that a lot of teens, especially young teens, those 13 and 14-year-olds, really want to talk to a parent or a trusted adult about pornography that they're seeing online. They either don't know how to have these conversations or with whom they should turn. So this really highlights the important role that parents and caregivers can play when talking to their teens about these types of tough and sensitive topics.
Thank you so much. I mean, I just think this is such important work, and I know this is very eye-opening for a lot of people. I think that last point you make about kids wanting parental advice is so important. That's why we're here tonight. So thank you again for taking the time to share this research with us. And I think we will turn now to our panelists. Peggy Orenstein is a New York Times bestselling author of Girls and Sex and Boys and Sex, along with some other wonderful books. She's also an award-winning journalist and an internationally recognized speaker on gender issues, especially those related to teens, sex, and relationships. Her latest book is called Unraveling, a Memoir. Dr. Ed Spector is a nationally recognized expert in digital addiction. Since 2009, Dr. Spector has specialized in the treatment of compulsive tech use in his Maryland practice, his Maryland-based private practice. So let's start with you, Peggy. Welcome. I'm so looking forward to having this conversation with both of you. And you know, Peggy, as a physician, I know, and I often talk with parents about the fact that curiosity about bodies, curiosity about sex is developmentally appropriate in tweens and teens. They are curious. So can you help parents think through healthy ways of addressing that curiosity and talking about sex with our kids?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because it's really important to recognize that, curiosity about sex is absolutely normal. And masturbation, yay, it's good for boys, it's good for girls, it's good for everybody in between and beyond those designations. And exploration of sexuality is also developmentally normal. And also there's a lot of different kinds of pornography. There's queer porn, there's feminist porn, but that's not what kids see. And I think it's important to understand what happened, which is that when Pornhub went online in 2007, it dropped the paywall and it allowed everything that you can imagine, and a lot of things that frankly nobody wants to imagine, to be free and easily accessible to anybody with a phone or a computer. And that's what changed. And that's what kids see. And that sort of pornography is, it's limited, it's distorted. It shows sex as something men do to rather than with women, portrays female pleasure as a performance for male satisfaction. Bodies are distorted. There's no warmth. There's no love. There's no consent often. And so the thing is, though, that as adults, we tend to focus when we talk to kids on risk and danger. So, whether it's pregnancy, whether it's disease, whether it's consent and assault, whether it's pornography, that's our focus. And that keeps us in this place of fear. And so rather than always talking about risk and danger, although all those things are incredibly important that I just listed, it's important for us to reframe the conversation as one about responsibility and joy when we talk about sexuality, and recognizing that what we want is to raise children who have a sense of positive sexuality, who have a sense of our values around relationships, who understand connection, who understand caring, who prioritize respect, communication, warmth, humanity, mutual pleasure, regardless of whether the relationship they're in lasts for 5 minutes or 5 years. And everything in the culture, whether it's mainstream media or pornography, is pushing them towards something else. So talking to our kids from a young age about what makes a good relationship, what makes a good friendship, what does that sound like? What makes a good conversation? How does that translate to romantic relationships? When kids are little, naming their body parts accurately. If you wouldn't call your elbow your woo-woo, don't call your vulva your woo-woo. Give things their correct name. Saying things like, yeah, it feels really good to touch your vulva or your penis, but we don't do that at grandma's Thanksgiving table, when you have the toddler who's masturbating, as they tend to do. So starting to have little conversations along the way that create a scaffolding that you're building so that as kids grow older, you're talking about relationships, you're talking about sexuality, and that as part of that larger conversation, then you're also talking about what pornography is and what pornography is not, as they're actively considering their own needs, desires, limits, and how they interact and recognize those values in their partners.
That's fantastic. I think that's so helpful, and to think about it broadly, especially when kids are young. It's easier to start these conversations when they're younger, of course, but just talking about relationships in general, even before you're talking about sexual relationships, to pave the road. I love that. One of the things, and one more question for you, Peggy, before we get to Ed, is, when I talk with parents about kids and porn, I find that most of them do think of porn consumption as gendered. And as we just heard from Supreet, that cis boys and girls, we found, were viewing porn at more or less the same rate. And I'm curious whether, because I know you talk so much about, gender differences, whether this surprised you or not.
Yeah. So, I think that that's something that has really evolved and changed. And, the thing is that both boys, girls, and those in between and beyond, they are using pornography as a de facto sex educator. And that is, I know that all of you would rather poke yourself in the eye with a fork than have to talk to your child about pornography. But we don't have the luxury of silence. It's not like our parents' generation. We have to talk to them about what's real and not real and missing, because they're bringing these messages into the bedroom. And what I found in my work with adolescents was that girls would be more likely to say, all kids used it, for masturbation, but girls would be more likely to say that they used it as an instruction manual for what they thought boys would want and expect. And boys would often say, I know the difference between fantasy and reality. That was how they tried to shut down a conversation. Not so sure that's true. Pornography is media. And any media, as we know at Common Sense Media, that we consume influences our thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and behaviors, even when we think it doesn't. Any Russian troll with a Facebook account to tell you that one. But the truth is what we know is that among college-age boys, that those who regularly consume pornography have been found to be more likely than others to think its images are real and to want to enact some of the more aggressive activities it depicts, that regular pornography users are less satisfied than other guys with their partnered experience and their sexual performance in partners' bodies. And I think that's one place to start, not shaming or blaming, but saying, we want you to have a great sex life. We want you to have fantastic relationships. But the way guys use pornography today, not going to get you there.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there are so many parents cringing right now because it is so hard to think about, particularly when people start watching porn in their tweens or teen years before they've had real life sexual interactions from which to, process the imagery that they're seeing. That this is complicated. So Ed, let me turn to you with another piece of this that for me as both a physician and as a mother, this was probably the hardest piece of the research for me to absorb, which was that more than half of the teens who'd been watching porn that were surveyed said that they had seen pornography depicting rape, choking, or someone in pain. Teens also reported encountering racial and ethnic stereotypes in pornography. So among those teens that are seeing porn, and again, considering both accidental and intentional exposure, a lot of them are seeing some pretty disturbing content. So Ed, does this come up in your practice, and how should parents address aggressive or violent or racist sexual imagery with their kids?
Well, I think one of the first things to sort of it highlights for me is that we have to prepare our kids for what they're going to see before they see it as best we can. And we know that media is flush with all kinds of very disturbing images. And so having this conversation, ideally when they're young and before they see it, really avoids the damage that I sometimes see in clients where the adults are sort of entering the scene after they discover it. And it's been happening for a long time. And when there's a parental vacuum that occurs where there isn't parental influence, we see someone else comes in and teaches their values to your kids. And kids don't understand how media affects them very well. So we understand that perfectly well. They don't. And so we need to first teach them how to be good media consumers and recognize that it does affect them. And then, of course, we have to, have many conversations with them about how it might affect them. I see porn comes up in a number of ways in my practice. My practice is entirely male, so all my clients are male with rare exception, and they're all teens or adults, young adults, like in their 20s. And everyone who comes to see me is coming typically with some compulsive pattern around technology, with maybe like 30% of the people coming specifically because it's adult content that they're looking at compulsively. So that's sort of what I'm speaking to. And those clients, when they come to me, sometimes I'm helping a younger kid who's been exposed and then traumatized or really confused. And that's a terrible position to be in. And so we want to be as thoughtful as we can in age-appropriate ways to sort of guide our kids for what they're gonna see, because that's what we need to prepare them for. And I'll give an example that's personal, which is with my own son. When he was maybe 10 or 11, he really got into anime. Anime was going to be his jam, and I could just tell it was something that he was going to love. And he was asking to, go online and view it. And of course, these anime sites, the sites where anime is, are really not geared toward 11, 12-year-old kids. They have explicit pornographic anime as well. There are adult anime, oriented toward adults there as well. And so I knew I had to say something, because I knew if at some point when I wasn't there on someone else's computer, he was going to Google anime and then possibly see some pretty scary content. And so I had to prepare him for that. I had to say, listen, I want to let you know that there's anime that you're watching that's really wholesome and like meant for kids, but there's also anime. There's also anime that is meant for adults, where and the way you'll know that is that there's really significant violence and nudity, and you probably would be really unhappy if you ran into that. So I need you to know about that. If you're going to go look at your own anime, that there might be things that you see there, and let's talk about that and answer questions about it. And I had that conversation with my son. Maybe he was 10 or 11. He doesn't remember the conversation at all, which is sort of amusing to me, because I think it really did affect him. And I saw it play out later, now that he's 15, and has more access to things, and is aware of some of those other things. It's definitely played out for him where he was prepared for it in that early conversation, so we didn't get surprised by it. I think the issue is, I was worried my son was going to press the wrong button and all of a sudden be seeing tentacle porn, which is a thing, and then he'd be traumatized for life, and I'd be having to send him to therapy for 20 years. So I was trying to avoid that, and I think parents have to be aware of where they're exposing their kids, and where their kids might get exposure. And it really, even if you've locked down everything, like the kid on the bus next to your son who's got a phone that isn't locked can show all kinds of things, and all of a sudden your kid's really confused.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing up the anime, because I think that is really popular with a lot of tweens and teens, and a lot of parents don't realize that there is a genre of anime porn. So that's important to know about. And I really appreciate the point you're making about like getting to that, having this conversation in advance. It's almost, now we know from this research, it's practically inevitable that they will either stumble upon or seek out porn. Yeah. So if we can come at them in that way, like letting them know that they will at some point see something, right? And that we as their trusted adults, want to have this conversation with them. I think establishing ourselves as parents as being askable and approachable is really important. Peggy, do you, I know you write about the impact, since Ed is talking so much about the boys, you've written about sort of performance sex and how porn impacts women and their expectations, in a sexual encounter. Do you want to just speak a little so we hear both sides?
I also want to, I meant to start by saying thank you for this research so much, because it really does put quantitative work to what I think Ed and I have been seeing for many years and hearing for many years, and everything that you say with it just was rings so true, and it's enormously helpful. And to also, when kids are little, to be able to say, you very well might run into these things online that that upset you or disturb you or make you uncomfortable, involving naked bodies, involving, really anything, violence, all kinds of stuff, not necessarily related to pornography. And we can talk about that. You won't get in trouble. This is something that we need to talk about. It's a problem on the internet. So opening that door is super important. For girls, what they would often talk about was this kind of way that, and this was true for mainstream media too, but just reinforced by pornography, that sex becomes all about performance. And I remember one girl talking to me and saying that she started feeling like she was outside of her body. It's called spectatoring. And she would watch herself and think, what would she do? She would put her arm here now. She would do this now. She would, perform this sex act. And I said, well, who is she? Who are you talking about? And she said, I don't even know. It's just like the actresses in porn. I just think that's, that's what's in my head. So that's a big issue for girls.
Yeah. I think, when I talk with parents of tweens and younger teens, it's so hard to imagine them as sexual beings, for parents. And I think if that's getting in the way of some of these conversations, to just sort of project forward, think of them at whatever makes you more comfortable as full-grown adults, married, whatever your values are. But hopefully you want for them to eventually be emotionally and physically healthy in their adult sex lives. And this is a piece of getting them there, is to have these conversations in advance so they can be critical thinkers when they encounter porn, so they're not in a situation like Peggy just described, like feeling like they have to perform a certain way, or so that they understand it a little better. It's hugely important. Ed, we had a viewer question that was, I thought, such a good one and is perfect for you. And you started to touch on this, but I think sometimes parents are concerned, particularly with the younger kids, is how do you have this conversation without making kids curious and having them Google or go looking, to understand what is this that people are talking about. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, it's really tricky, because I can't say that the chances of them looking it up after or being curious is going to be greater than, it's going to be zero. Like, of course, you're going to potentially raise questions and curiosity with them. I see the other end of it as being so much more damaging. And obviously everyone has to make their own decision. I mean, there's so many different variables here. Think about, like, we might have almost 2,000 people listening tonight, 2,000 different families, all might have very different values, different situations, different kids with different strengths, weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and all of that comes into play. So when I'm working with a family around this issue, the first thing I do is get to know them really well and understand where they're coming from in terms of what, their values. Are they a really religious family? And so the answer is they really want to get to zero, or they want this to be zero. Is this a family that's, very laissez-faire about it, but they just want to make sure their son grows up to be healthy? I really sort of first figure out the values of the family, so that then we can set up goals that are consistent with that. So it's not that I'm making a decision, a clinical decision directly about how we're going to handle this. It's really informed by, that particular family and that particular situation with that particular kid. So for the listeners tonight, I want to make sure you're like, if your kid has ADHD or autism, it's going to change any of these conversations, and it's going to change what your goals are and what your worries are, where the harm might be. So all of that's going to inform the kind of conversation you're going to have, how you're going to approach it, and when you're going to approach it. But of course, there's the possibility that you're going to create curiosity. But the question is that curiosity and what they would see after you've created the lens for them of how to understand what they're going to see, is that worse than them seeing it somewhere without you and really being confused and not knowing who to reach out to or who to talk to, and being like, well, no one ever told me about this. So like, now what? Like, what do I'm feeling all these things and I don't really understand it. That's a really sort of vulnerable place for a kid to be. And someone else is going to step in, whether it's media or whether it's a friend, and try to instruct your kid in that moment. And it's really our job to create that lens, that like sort of how are you going to look at the world and understand it through these conversations. And by the way, I wanted to piggyback on something that was said earlier, which is like this conversation, it shouldn't just be about sexuality. It should be about media in general, all media, and all technology and how it affects families, so that the family is really comfortable talking about media in general, so that when you jump into a conversation like this, you're much more likely to hit it with some precedence already beforehand. So it's not like really awkward for you or for them.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, those broader conversations, but I also, what you're saying about every family's different, right? They really, truly are. And I know people love to get scripts. You can't give one script that's going to work for everyone. So figuring out how this works within your family is so important. I wanted to touch on something I think is very important is how to best support LGBTQIA youth. And there was, really interest in this research there, because the thought was that LGBTQ plus kids are possibly using porn differently than their straight peers might be. And the results showed that rates of intentional porn consumption was indeed higher for teens who were LGBTQ plus. And these teens were also more likely to say that they were viewing porn to find out what arouses and excites them. So overall, this suggests that these teens were using porn as they were exploring their own sexuality, perhaps because they're much less likely to be learning from parents or school or mainstream media about sex that's applicable to them. So are there specific issues we should be thinking of in terms of LGBTQ kids learning about sexuality from pornography, and how can we best support them in this context? Peggy, let's start with you.
Who are you asking? I do want to back up 1 second and say one really great resource. And I have a lot on my website, which is just my name. I have a lot of resources that to help you make those scripts for depending on the age and gender identity and sexual orientation of your child and all of those things. But one thing for the middle school set is amaze.org has a really good video on how on talking to pornography, talking about pornography, and also a parent piece that is, it's not explicit, it's lower key, it'll give you a little bit of a sense so that you don't just like flip out and say something you wish you hadn't said to your middle schooler. It's been consistent that LGBTQ plus kids look at more pornography, and they look at it because what else do they have, you know? And I don't think that that's necessarily better. You know, I mean, if you had a straight cis kid who never saw themselves reflected in the world in terms of their sexuality or their romantic identity, and all they had was porn, you wouldn't go, hey, that's good, that's affirming, you know? I mean, that's not great. And so, and yeah, there can be great queer porn. There can be really awful queer porn. There can be queer porn that, you know, reinforces power dynamics between adults and underage boys. There's all kinds of stuff out there. And I wish that queer kids had the opportunity in their families, in their schools, in their communities to have the kind of high quality education and experience that I wish also for their cis straight peers. And one of the things that we tend not to do, what I found with my research was that we have a lot more acceptance of what I call social queerness now. You know, the gay best friend or the theater kid or whatever. That's cool, but we don't talk about sexual practices very much. And so those young people continue to feel marginalized and stigmatized in their sexual practices. So not only, and I realize it's a big leap for parents who are straight who don't even talk to their straight kids to start talking to their kids who are queer about their sexual practices. But not only is that necessary, and this has become, you know, just horrifically politicized in our culture and in our schools, but we need to be talking to all kids about the range of sexual practices that all people engage in, not because they should, would, or will, but because we don't want the kids who are gay, the kids who are queer, the kids who have other kinds of sexual orientations and gender identities to feel that they are stigmatized, to feel that they're marginalized. So that's part of the greater sex education, so that they won't be forced in greater numbers to be looking for their sex education in a context of sexually explicit media.
I think that's so important, right? And I, you know, I think that when body parts go unnamed or sexual acts or when these conversations are kind of pushed to the side or ignored, that's where shame comes in and stigma comes in, right? So the more we can chip away at this as trusted adults and school communities and teachers, right, the better. It really positively impacts the health of all kids, the more that they can learn about
it's a safety issue as well, too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for that. Ed, I have a question for you, because this is something that comes up in the medical world, and that has to do with the question of whether porn is creating sexual dysfunction in younger people. So for instance, erectile dysfunction is something we hear about in older men, usually, who have chronic conditions like hypertension or diabetes, right. But I'm hearing more and more anecdotally about younger men who are watching a lot of porn and are having difficulty in their real life sexual interactions. Is that something that you are seeing in your practice? And if so, like how should we tackle those conversations?
So that's definitely playing out in my practice. And I saw certainly that was in the literature as well. And I started seeing it even 10 years ago, where, clients who've seen thousands of people depicted in sexual contexts of one shape or another, before they've ever even gotten a first kiss, before they've ever had any sort of connection or romantic connection or physical connection with anyone. And that kind of the intensity of it, the neural stimulation is not normal. It's not what's a part of the normal experience. So when they get to the real thing, when they get to the point where they're actually maybe older and able to have an experience, they're not able to have that experience. And so part of my conversation with all of my guys when we hit this topic is to really talk about what the influence is going to be on you. How might this affect you? And they really do care about that. They're aware that they're looking at images that are maybe un-PC or that aren't what they're being told is normal. And so I'll talk about how that might affect them, both in terms of being able to connect with real people when that opportunity arises, both emotionally and physically. And one of the things that I found that is helpful for my clients who come in with this problem already existing, so they're not able to have sex, is to go to a 50-50 rule, which is just when you're being sexual, 50% of the time it is not with a screen. So that seems to both deal with the problem once it's emerged. And I also recommend that for my clients as well, that if you are going to be looking at porn on a regular basis, you want to at least reduce that from a harm reduction perspective, 50% of the time. Try to have that be without screens, so that you don't create this problem where you can't actually, have a healthy sort of experience that you'd want to have.
Wow. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. And Peggy, just on the other side of it, another thing that comes up in the medical world is the ways that porn is affecting young people's body image, not in the way we think of body image with, larger tech and Instagram and stuff, but very specifically like their body parts, right? Like their genitalia, their labia. Is this normal? And I know that you've talked about this as well. Would you like to?
Yeah, I have. Although I wanted to just touch on something that Ed just said, which about seeing so much before your first kiss. And I remember talking to a boy at one point when I was doing Boys and Sex, and he was a high school senior, and he said, and I think, even more than sort of the scary stuff that we've been talking about, he just paused at one point and he said, I think that porn affects your ability to be innocent in a sexual relationship, and that the whole idea of exploring sex without any preconceived ideas of what it is, and that he said that natural, or is it okay if I swear, Dolly? Can I swear?
It's okay with me.
He said that natural organic process has just been fucked by porn. And I felt like that, it was the sadness of that, the sadness of not having that opportunity. And yeah, it is totally, the thing with the girls and the shaving their pubic hair or removing their pubic hair removal is very much linked to pornography. It started there, where it was really there to get a camera shot. And it was another way that girls learned that how they look or how they perform for others is more important than how something feels to themselves. And I thought a lot about the 1920s when flapper dresses came in, right? And that was the first time that women's legs and armpits were available for public scrutiny. And so that was when they started removing their hair on their legs and their armpits. And the same sort of had held true with genitalia. And I would say, they would always say, well, I do it for myself. And, first of all, I'd be like, really? If you were on a desert island with nothing but a razor, this is how you would spend your time? I don't know about that. But as we pushed further, it was very much about being afraid of humiliation, being afraid of what people would say. And that was really hard. And then I guess there was another piece that I wanted to address, thinking about what Ed said, in terms of the media literacy perspective for boys and girls. But I think that understanding, in terms of erectile dysfunction, all of that, understanding a little bit about physiology and understanding why extreme images might provoke a response that you don't expect, like an erection, is really important, and that doesn't necessarily mean you're turned on. And Emily Nagoski, who's brilliant and writes about the science of desire, she talks about it like it's being tickled by somebody that you don't like. Like, you might laugh, but that doesn't mean you're enjoying yourself, right? And the fancy word for that is genital non-concordance. And it's why, for instance, a woman could lubricate or orgasm during an assault. That's just the body being the body. Doesn't mean you want it. And that said, when something is sexual and taboo, like eroticized violence or degradation, it can trigger a mental response that's like if I said to you, Dolly, stop thinking about polar bears. You right now, stop. Don't you think about polar? Like, you weren't thinking about polar bears. Now you can't, because embedded in that idea of don't think about polar bears is think about polar bears. And embedded in the idea of don't respond to that sexually relevant information because it's objectionable to you is respond to that sexually relevant information because it's objectionable to you. And the tension can actually turbocharge arousal and make something that is objectionable to you feel more exciting than something that's overtly desired. And so I think, as kids are older, obviously you can't do this with younger kids, but starting to talk about that kind of thing and knowing that can give young people a better critical lens on sexually explicit material and maybe get them thinking a little bit about the difference between what is just super arousing and what is actually pleasurable, desired, and wanted.
Yeah, and maybe help them sort through, because you can see how there could be very conflicting emotions there, right? Feeling aroused by something that otherwise you might find reprehensible, right, in everyday life, and what that means. Do you want to follow up with
Well, I
that?
mean, there was another way of saying that, which I heard recently at a conference, where it was sexual arousal is not politically correct. It, it does what it's going to do, and so people will often find themselves in these confusing situations where what they're watching is reprehensible but yet arousing, and they're trying to figure out what the difference is. And I thought, Peggy really described that well, in terms of that physiology just is physiology. That's the body being the body.
Yeah.
It's also true with, with things like, I don't know if you would call this pornography exactly, but like 50 Shades of Grey is a really good example of this, because there's a bunch of points in that series, which a lot of girls read, where he says, your body is saying yes. And again, that's the body being the body. What do her words say? That's what we know. So it's really important to understand that and to differentiate there.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we were heartened by in this conversation was that the kids, many of them reported that conversations with trusted adults can point them toward healthy ways to explore their sexuality. So even though less than half, only 43% of teens in our research reported that they've had conversations about pornography with a trusted adult, we can all do better, right? Most who had those conversations said that the conversations encouraged them to find other ways to explore their sexuality besides pornography. So to me, this is a cue for parents to get brave about these conversations, and earlier than you think you might need to. Another takeaway from the research is that kids actually get that what they see in porn is acting and not real life, which is great to hear because we've been drilling into that message for years. Nonetheless, 45% felt that porn gave them helpful information about sex. So in other words, despite knowing that the porn they were seeing is not an accurate representation of sex, they're still interested in looking at porn and learning from porn. So this really makes parents' conversations around this topic a bit trickier. So, the overwhelming majority of questions that we're getting from viewers in this audience is how to get this conversation started. I know we've talked about the advanced level of all of this, but just for those parents who haven't started yet, like, help them chip away. How do we get started? Let's go with Ed first.
Okay. I think the most helpful advice I can give, and I thought a lot about, like, how do you give advice to thousands of people at once? And I think the answer is you give them the decision tree and the variables that are important, and then you let them move through the tree. So the first part of this process is the adults have to decide, what do they want to convey? What are their values? What's the lens through which they want their kid to look at this stuff and understand it? So first you have to have a sort of come to Jesus about, like, how do you feel about this, and what do you want your kid's takeaway to be? And if there's multiple parents, then you both have to be on the same page, really. If you're very different in terms of how you view this, it's not going to go well. So one is, first, know yourself. Then you have to know the kid. So you have to pay attention to what are their strengths and their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities. If you have a kid who's immature, makes poor judgment, is impulsive, maybe has ADHD, that's going to be a very different set of concerns and a very different set of sort of cautionary things you're going to want to do, versus someone who's very maybe anxious or cautious or risk averse. And so you want to know who your kid, and their age also is relevant too. And so you can look at those scripts as mentioned as well, in terms of how much detail do you put in this. And again, you want this to be embedded in a much larger pattern of conversations about technology in general and how media affects people. So if you're doing all of that, then you sort of check in with yourself. How do we want to carry this? And then, what are our values? And then who's our kid and what do they need in this situation, then you're ready to proceed. Now, in terms of what you say and the modality of it, I think, I think there's a real advantage to not having eye contact during this conversation. So I usually recommend you go for a walk where you don't have to make eye contact and you can raise this, where someone doesn't feel like you're staring them down across the table. And I think you start, really basic, and you work your way up, getting as many questions as you can from them and finding out where they are through these experiences. So let me pause there. I'm really curious about what Peggy has to say.
So am I. Talk to us, Peggy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all about the shoulder to shoulder conversation. Trap them in the car. That's always a good one too. Playing ball, and guard, whatever you're doing, cooking, so that you're not making eye contact. I also think you can, there's a lot of occasions. I mean, y'all are in an audience tonight of people, of a conversation about pornography. You can say, hey, I realized saw this webcast on pornography in teenagers, and I'm curious to know sort of what you're seeing in your world and what's going on there. So, or you can happen to have in the car, I did, fresh air interviews for boys and sex and girls and sex. You can happen to have that podcast on and say, what do you think? Is she right, or is she like full of it? What's going on here? What do you think? So there's a lot of ways that you can sort of use whatever's going on. You can also use mainstream media. I mean, we've talked a lot about pornography tonight, but mainstream media communicates a lot of the same values, and it's not necessarily that much, it's only marginally less explicit, whether they're watching music videos or they're watching Euphoria or they're watching a lot of stuff. It also offers opportunity for healthy conversations. There's some great shows out there too, like Sex Education, Big Mouth, those shows that have taken more responsibility to try to bring these issues up in ways that kids can both hear, understand, and that take seriously what they're doing. I also find that, not like asking your child directly, hey, are you watching pornography? What, like that, you don't want to do that. But again, saying things like, what are you seeing? Making them the expert in their experience. So sort of asking what they're seeing among in their world, what they're seeing among their friends, what they think, asking them some questions about it. One trick I used to use when my daughter is now almost 20, but when she was younger, don't tell her this, okay? You 1400, I'm swearing you to silence here. But one trick that I always used to say was, I would say that somebody, a friend of mine, nobody specific, was having, was kind of wrestling with something with their child. And since their child is the same age, I'd be curious to know what advice she would give, since she's around. Like, if you were talking to if my friend needs to talk to her child about porn, like, what would you recommend? What do you think needs to be said? And I actually just had this conversation with my daughter, not what should I be telling my child about pornography, but I was telling her that I was doing this webinar and some other things. And she said, I think that's all really important. But I think the thing that is the very most important is that you talk to your child about what makes a healthy relationship, what makes a positive relationship, what it means to be a good friend, what it means to be a good partner. Those are, as we fuss a lot about sex, we fuss a lot about pornography, but we don't talk to our kids about our values about human connection. And one really great resource for that is making caring common. And again, I want to reinforce that our kids do want to hear from us, because there was another study by Emily Rothman, who I think we're going to talk about in a bit, who that looked at 14 to 24 year olds, and among the 18 to 24 year olds, the most what they cited as the most helpful information about how to have sex was pornography, and that actually edged out talking to your partner. The good news was, among 14 to 17 year olds, they said that their parents were the most helpful source of information about how to have sex. So we have this window, and it is really, really important that we take it. And I know it's hard, especially maybe for fathers who don't tend to be tasked with this, and who, boys particularly, really wanted to hear from their dads about sex emotional intimacy, even about their father or father figure, about that person's regrets. And I think that you have to, I mean, I know you weren't raised that way, right? Most of us weren't, but you don't have to be perfect. I think that's my other big piece of advice. You don't have to know all the answers. You don't have to know all the questions. If you haven't done it yet and you're thinking, oh gosh, it's so late in the game, you can own that and say, there's a bunch of conversations that we haven't had that we need to have. And I know that they're hard, but I want to start having them for your well-being so that you'll be a happier, more contented individual who can have the kinds of relationships that I want you to have. You don't have to have the perfect relationship yourself. And I just say to start where you can, start where you can and think of it as an opportunity to show up for your child and scaffold toward the relationship you want to have once your child is out of the house and grown, and to model difficult conversations, because how are our children going to know how to have difficult conversations if we don't show them how?
So much of what you said is so golden. I wish I could. I can't wait to watch the recording and take notes on all of it. But you are so right about the teachable moments, and also what you said about parents. So I see this so much. Parents, it's coming from such a beautiful place, like wanting to get it right. But there's this like perfectionism in parenting. And if the wanting to get it right is getting in the way of you having the conversation at all, then maybe just good enough is good enough, right? Yeah. And so I just want parents to like start chipping away and be open to this. And truly media is such a great, way to have those conversations. And now you're talking about characters on a show rather than your own kid.
Right. Or you can have a do-over. You can also say, I really blew that when I tried to talk about it before, and I really like face planted. Can we try that one again? I have
100%. 100%.
Don't inundate, don't flood, just like a little bit.
Right. Oh, that's key too. Like Lisa said at the beginning, don't go home tonight and brain dump all of this, right? Little bits at a time. This is a huge conversation, and it's one that's going to evolve as teens grow. And so the more we can just start chipping away at it, the better. You mentioned the Emily Rothman. There are 2 Common Sense new articles out about having these kids, having these conversations with our kids for younger and older kids, because the ages really, truly, it matters what age and stage your child is at. So please, those will be in the chat. Let's check that out. And I kind of want to end with one other thought, which is about shame, right? So what the majority of teens in this survey who had seen porn, 67% said that they felt okay about the amount of pornography they watched, and yet 50% of them reported feeling guilty or ashamed after watching porn. So how do we minimize the shame around sexuality and porn so that they're more likely to open up? We've sort of touched on it, but just sort of maybe some parting thoughts about that shame piece.
I think there really is power to having, if there's a role model who's a male, particularly for boys, to be able to have conversations with dads or uncle. I'm often functioning that way in my practice. I think there's real power to talking about, for instance, feminism and how that is being not depicted, or consent is not being depicted in these kinds of images. How would a real relationship play out? As someone who was raised by a single dad, like I had wonderful conversations with him about this kind of stuff that were really, really helpful. And I do applaud the notion that we really need to focus on the whole thing, the relationships, how to connect with people, how to be a good person, how to be a good friend, how to be a good lover, how to be focused where it needs to be with the whole experience with the other person. All of those kinds of conversations can play in. But I wanted to also say one other thing, which is one of the more common parenting mistakes that we make is we don't answer the question they asked. We answer way more, and then we flood them, and they're like, well, I just wanted to know this one thing, and then you just gave me way too much information. So it's really important when you're starting this dialogue, particularly with younger kids, really answer the questions that they ask. And make sure you get clarity. Well, I just want to make sure I understand what you're asking about. What you said was this. Is that what you meant? What did you mean? So that when you answer the question, you also don't flood them the way they would be flooded if They went onto a website they weren't supposed to go onto. You want to make sure you don't do the same thing in your practice as you're trying to like, sort of help them through this content.
Such a great point. And I think that especially when parents are nervous, that's where that tendency comes out 100%. Peggy, your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing, again, when we're talking to older kids and you talk about those sort of physiology issues, shame is part of the goal there. Shame, in a weird way, gets you to keep coming back and keep looking at it. And since the real goal of pornography is to keep your eyeballs on it, it's not to teach you about sex. It's not really to make you feel good. It's to make money. It's to get, it's to drive traffic. And shame contributes to that. So understanding that, again, from a media literacy perspective, I think can be super helpful. And then the other piece is, again, not only focusing on risk and danger, but making this distinction, making an understanding, curiosity about sexuality is normal. Masturbation is normal. Starting to explore sexually and have relationships is part of the developmental task of a young person. All of that is really normal. And making sure that you are also educating and have material in your home and having discussions about positive sexuality, connected sexuality, what a healthy, joyful sexual relationship looks like, so that, sex as a whole is not something that becomes tainted or feels shameful, or that gets so wrapped up in what you find erotic and arousing.
So well said. I could talk to both of you all night long, but I think it's time we have to wrap. Thank you so much. This was, your insights are so important, and this was a really thoughtful conversation. And I'm also so grateful to Supreet for sharing the research that she conducted. I think this was really important. And for everyone watching in the audience, I hope you found this helpful. Common Sense's goal is to help you feel confident about the overall landscape, so that when there's important conversations like this to have, or new technologies or apps crop up, which they will, your family will be prepared to deal with them. So thank you, and thanks for including me in this conversation, and I look forward to the next time. And I'm going to send it over to Lisa.
So much, Dolly. And I also want to thank Ed and Peggy and Supreet for their incredible insight and guidance during this really important conversation. And thanks to all of you for watching to learn about this tricky topic. I encourage you to consult Common Sense Media's resources as you continue to work through the challenges of raising kids in today's connected world. We also have a free newsletter that I encourage you to sign up for. And I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day and giving us time to talk about how we can best support our kids. Thank you so much, and be well.